Colonel, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
We're certainly living in interesting times, and the world is, I guess we both know, is at a very critical juncture. How much of where we're at, Colonel, is due to maybe a lack of leadership from the West?
Well, I don't know. It depends on how you define the leadership. Usually in the United States, we define leadership as bullying other countries into doing what we would like them to do. And I think that's been largely the case since 1965. People would argue that we engaged in some of that in the 50s, and I think that's partially true. But in the 50s, we were normally acting to prevent communist parties from seizing control in places like Italy or Greece or Iran or other countries. Sometimes the intervention made sense and sometimes it did not. But we were not actively bullying people into a particular strategic direction at the time. We didn't have to, because we were effectively the last man standing at the end of the Second World War.
Yeah.
Everyone else was exhausted and worn out. We represented something like 60-70% of world gross domestic product. Today, it's down to, I think, 30%.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very different world then. And it was only natural and hopeful, frankly, that the rest of the world would eventually recover from the destructive experience of the Second World War. I think that's happened. We've never adapted to that. And we have chosen to ignore it because we don't like it. Whatever we can't control and dominate, we tend to treat as either an enemy state or a potential adversary. That's been going on since we intervened in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the big problems for the United States. You can be friends with us as long as you don't dispute anything that we do, and you do pretty much what we prefer that you do. And when you don't, you're in trouble. We use our global financial prowess to punish you. We use the SWIFT system to punish you.
Yep.
We enact sanctions against you. So when you talk about the leadership from the West, I don't think there's leadership anywhere else but from us, but it's bad. Whatever leadership we used to get, I think pretty much ended with Harold Macmillan in Britain. He was the last one who made any sense and stood up and said, have you lost your minds? Why are you going to Vietnam? If you think we're going to follow you, you've got another thing coming. That's when de Gaulle was in France and effectively said the same thing and said this NATO plan has no long-term future. Get out of France. I could go down the list. You know, we had a different set of actors with a different set of values and experience. You know, one of the things, if you talk about leadership at the national level, and I often do, I sometimes say the last president who really had a grasp of all the things that are important to be a good president was really Eisenhower.
Okay.
Now, Eisenhower was not a particularly good general. In fact, I think he was a pretty poor general.
You're right, okay.
Didn't do very well during the Second War, but then again, we had a very weak bench. We didn't have much talent. The most talented and intelligent man who had the best grasp strategically of everything was Douglas MacArthur. And FDR did everything he could to minimize him and stuck him out in the Western Pacific in the hopes that the world would not hear much from him. But Eisenhower was sort of a debutante. He was somebody that looked good. He modeled well on the stage. He wasn't the only one. And Marshall picked him and sent him over, but Marshall had a lot of trouble with him. But the thing that distinguished Eisenhower from many of his peers was that Eisenhower learned from every mistake he made. He learned about how things really operate in the international system. He began to understand the people that he was dealing with. So when he became president of the United States, he was really ready to handle the job. And you'll recall that he ran specifically on a platform that implied he would end the Korean War. He never said he would do that, but that was the implication. And of course, he said, I will go to Korea and I will have an answer and I will do what is in the interest of the American people. So he did. And he got over there and he was immediately given a briefing by General Mark Clark, one of the people that emerged from the Second World War as a four-star. And Clark gave him this briefing in 1952, early 53, actually, and said, well, Mr. President, what we need now are 890,000 troops so that we can launch a major invasion of China, march in through Manchuria and around and down into Beijing, and we will win the war. And Eisenhower listened politely, and then he walked out of the tent with his military assistant, and he said, Clark has lost his mind. The American people have absolutely no interest in a major war with China.
Yeah.
In fact, someday we may want to get along with China, regardless of what the government is at the moment. We don't want a war with the Chinese. So the military said, sir, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to politely end this the best way I possibly can. So he immediately said, forget it. Well, of course, the opinion polls at that point in the United States, about 58, 59% were adamantly opposed to the war and said, what the hell are we doing there? We have no business being there. This is when most Americans paid attention and thought that we belonged in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
Novel idea. And Eisenhower tended to agree with that. But Eisenhower understood we inherited a lot of obligations for the Second War, and we couldn't just pack up and leave everywhere. But he came to a resolution of the conflict. It wasn't easy. We got out, and we left very few forces behind, and we set up what turned out to be a relatively stable situation on the peninsula. And then subsequently, when he signed on for NATO, he said, if NATO still exists 10 years after we found it, it's a failure.
Mm-hmm.
Because he said, this is not the way forward with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union will inevitably change. He, of course, had listened to George Kennan. And George Kennan told him, no, we don't want to go to war with the Soviets, but we want to wait them out. The system itself will implode. Of course, I think he and others thought it would implode a little sooner than it did, but ultimately it did implode on its own. All this business about Ronald Reagan beat the Soviets and won the Cold War is a lot of crap. The Soviet system was destined to doom. Anybody who studied it knew that. It was just a question of when. So, we misinterpret things to flatter ourselves. And George Kennan said most of what we do in foreign policy is designed to flatter ourselves. And we suffer from an acute case of national narcissism. In fact, I think it's as bad, if not worse, than the case that once afflicted Britain during the outbreak of World War I. The same sort of mentality. Yeah. We've got the men, we've got the ships, we've got the money too, kind of nonsense. But Eisenhower understood that. He did understand economics. He understood what had to happen, and so he cut spending. He cut back on the armed forces at a point in time when everybody insisted we had to spend more. And he used to hold very interesting sort of seminars once a month with the Joint Chiefs, and they hated to meet with him because he'd been a four-star general. He knew what went on in the Pentagon. And they would sit there and they would say, one said, well, sir, we need 26 divisions to deal with the Soviets when they attack in Europe. And then he said, well, that's interesting. How many ships do you have and how many aircraft do you have? And how many troops can you ship over there in time to meet the threat if it materializes? So they said, well, I don't know. So we go back and find out. Well, he returned and said, well, we could move 15,000 men. He said, good, that's your requirement. Shut up. And of course, he was first to point out that how are you going to get across the Atlantic with the Soviets?
Yeah.
They have these things called submarines. Everybody had forgotten from 1939 to 1943. How many years is that? 4 years to defeat the German U-boat threat. Today, the threat is infinitely greater and more potent. So how are you going to reinforce anything? So he had he was a practical man, and he was looking for practical solutions. He wanted to keep things not necessarily in a frozen state, but stable. And he strongly supported Austria's bid for neutrality. You remember, of course, Austria broke away from Germany after World War II.
Yep.
And finally, Kreisky, Bruno Kreisky, who was the chancellor, said, it's time for us to get these Russians out of here. How do we get the Russians out? They said, well, we become neutral. And they put together a very good treaty. The treaty was circulated to Eisenhower. He looked at it. They circulated it to Moscow. Moscow agreed. Eisenhower agreed. You know what? Eisenhower said, well, thank God, that's a front we don't have to worry about. And he said, perhaps we should neutralize more states in Eastern Europe because we Americans can't possibly defend them all. Gee, what a novel way to think. He did not see any danger whatsoever to neutrality in that sense. He saw it as a positive thing. And of course, Austrian neutrality has worked very well. And that's one of the reasons that you go to somebody like Orban in Hungary and says, you've lost your minds. There's no reason to fight these people. I know these people. We could have had Ukraine neutralized just as Austria was. And Austria has thrived as a result of neutrality. They have a higher standard of living now for the first time in their history than Germany. The Germans always looked down on the Austrians as, they're the Alabamans, they're the poor Southerners. Not anymore. They live better than the Germans do. So he had a different view of that. Then he looked, of course, at, you command the armed forces, you understand the economy, you also have to get yourself elected. Well, that was something he knew nothing about. But he was such a successful figure and so well known, people were writing in as his opponent in many places Santa Claus, because everybody knew that nobody had a chance to defeat Eisenhower.
Yep.
You look at those kinds of attributes and understanding a sense of what the American people can and can't do. And one of the things that he said repeatedly in private to everyone who would listen is, we Americans can never do again what we did during World War II. We will never sustain those high casualties that the Germans and the Soviets took. We will never, ever mobilize our whole nation to send all of these forces overseas. It's simply impossible. So he was trying to break us out of that World War II paradigm. But he was succeeded by John F. Kennedy, and Kennedy was a good man. But Kennedy, along with Richard Nixon later on, both of them served in the Second World War. Kennedy, of course, was in the Pacific, and he looked out across the Pacific and he saw thousands of ships. He saw hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of airplanes. He said, my God, we're the greatest country in the world. There's nothing we can't do. And of course, Nixon was out there in the Pacific with him. He reached the same conclusion. And so when they become president, they see this America as being very different from the way Eisenhower saw it. Eisenhower remembered sending a letter in early January of 1945 to George Marshall after the Ardennes offensive, which really shook him to the foundations. Mm-hmm. And he said to General Marshall, I think we're going to need another 10 or 15 divisions. I'm not confident we can get this done, and so forth. And Marshall sent him back a note saying, you're going to damn well end the war with what you got. Nothing else is coming. We're tapped out. And at that point, we had maybe 90 divisions. Now, today, somebody can't even understand that. I mean, the numbers of forces and equipment and everything else is beyond everybody's comprehension. But Eisenhower understood what had gone on. Then he saw the horrendous casualties. By the way, we lied about the casualties. We said the Germans had sustained 200,000 casualties. No. The real figures were finally released within the last few years. We sustained 68,000, or the Germans sustained 68,000 casualties, of whom only 11,000 were killed.
Yeah, right.
We lost over 24,000, and we had almost 200,000 casualties. Yep. So we just reversed the numbers and lied. You say that to people, say, oh, my goodness, how could they possibly do that?
That's part of the game, isn't it?
Oh, show me a general who's not going to lie.
Exactly.
So anyhow, he was a sober-minded individual, and he was always trying to hold things within limits. Limit the spending, limit the commitments, limit the damage. The people that followed him had this unfortunate habit of seeing us as the land of infinite abundance. And here we sit.
So what aren't we understanding about the East?
Well, I don't think most Americans pay any attention, first of all, to anything that happens overseas. They only began paying attention to what happens here as they watched their jobs exported overseas.
Yep.
Then people began to wake up and say, well, what happened to the factories, the manufacturing base? Where have they all gone? That used to be a great strength for us. And eventually they began to figure out that they were sold out, not by the government per se, but by corporate power, by the people that controlled the manufacturing base. And it was cheaper to do things somewhere else, and they profited enormously, and the government certainly wasn't going to get in their way because of all those wonderful campaign contributions that poured in. So I think that began to sink in the 90s, finally. That began, by the way, under the great Ronald Reagan. Nobody ever points that out, but it all began under him, along with amnesty for 1 million Mexicans and others from Latin America who were illegal.
Yep.
So as soon as you see amnesty under Reagan, that's where you watch the curve go up through the roof.
Right.
And of course, the argument at the time is this is a one-time affair. This will help tamp down illegal immigration. Well, the opposite was the case. So all I'm trying to say is that everybody looks around and is angry right now. Why do I face inflation? Why is my
unemployment
have I
going
got
up?
a 21% rise in the cost of food?
Yep.
Why do I have a 7.1% mortgage on a 30-year house mortgage? Why are all these things happening? Well, it started a long time ago. Americans didn't pay much attention. Now they're paying attention. And I think it's going to be hell to pay in the near term and in the long term, probably.
I spoke to an Australian, funny enough, in the US a couple of weeks ago, just from a business call. And I said, "You live in Florida?" He said, "Yes. I've been here for only a very short period of time. What's it feel like?" And he said, "I spoke to my wife and I spoke to my family." He said, "I've never lived in anything like this before. It almost feels like it's a civil war there." Now, I didn't think it was, I thought a bit of an extreme. And I said, "Are you serious?" He said, "No, everyone here is on the edge." Is that the case?
Yes, very
Really?
much so. I mean, I spend half my time in Florida where I'm a CEO for Our Country, Our Choice. I'm there for about 7 to 10 days. Then I come home again for 7 days and I go back down there. I still have a consulting business here in Virginia, though most of that takes me to places like Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio, but because it's involved with coal and rare earths and so forth.
Yep.
So I travel around and everywhere I go, I encounter that. And of course, sometimes you see people that are just flat broke. And again, we've always had lots of people that live from paycheck to paycheck. That's not news. You can't get people to save to the extent that you would like them to. But I think it's very bad now. And we're on the verge of some major financial crisis, I suspect. And it's going to be very bad at that point.
So what are the Americans going to be voting on? I still haven't quite worked out the platform. So maybe from your perspective, if Trump comes back in or Kamala Harris wins, what does that look for Americans? And what does it look for?
Well, you have three candidates.
Yeah, you do.
You really have three. You have RFK Jr. in the middle. Yep. He's not really in the middle. He's just standing apart.
Yep.
Both parties, along with the media, have worked very, very hard to suppress him because he's a man who has studied the issues and actually has some answers.
Yeah.
And he's fluent in the language and can discuss them. What matters pertaining to our economy, to the scientific industrial base, to pharmaceutical industries, to health. He has real plans and programs, but he doesn't get a chance to say very much. Right now, they're trying to keep him out of the next debate in September. And that, of course, the people that control the debate and who gets to participate are members of the two parties, Republicans and Democrats.
Yes.
So it's not a government-run operation. So I don't expect that he'll be allowed to go into it. Who knows? And then you look at Donald Trump, and Donald Trump stands up, as Donald does, and he gives great speeches at rallies. He promises everybody everything. I'll bring down inflation. I'll feed you again. You'll be great again. We'll be wonderful again. And I'll rebuild the armed forces. Woof, 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 woof. Okay. How? Bam, silence. And then you have Harris. I think some senators said the only difference between her and this Ocasio-Cortez, this congressman, is that Ocasio-Cortez has experience as a bartender, and as far as we can tell, Harris has no experience at all in anything. She's an empty facade. She knows nothing. That's why she has no interviews of any kind with anybody.
Yeah, saw that.
And she has enormous Wall Street support. Because she's promising that nothing will change. And that's the most popular candidate for the people with money, for the billionaire oligarchs, for Wall Street. And of course, she also represents the racial divide in the United States.
Yeah.
Although she doesn't seem to be able to make up her mind what she is. That's neither here nor there. So you've got this, the racial issue, which is an undercurrent, which, by the way, has always been with us. Everybody acts as though this is remarkable. It's not. De Tocqueville, who wrote about us in the 1840s, the Frenchman talked about it. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, came over here at the turn of the century. He talked about it. Yeah. This has always been with us. It's more acute now, I think, largely due to the massive influx of non-Europeans illegally into the country. That's just exacerbated all the tensions, made everything that much worse. And so you've got what the party of the left or the Democrats really call themselves now, the party of color.
Yeah, okay.
And if you look at the electoral map and who votes for them,
yep.
Well, you look at the large cities, that's it. If you look at the counties in the United States, 95, 94% of all the counties in the United States are red, have always been red. If you go to the state of Pennsylvania, where I was raised,
Yep.
the outcome of elections over the last 30 or 40 years have been decided by two big cities, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Everyone in the state votes Republican, except the people in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And all the voting is fraudulent. I mean, literally fraudulent. They just stuff the ballot boxes with phony absentee ballots. They pull names and addresses off rolls of people that have been dead for years.
Mm-hmm.
It's always been a joke, that Resurrection Day was Election Day in all the big cities of the United States. Again, this is not a new problem. It's just gotten worse, and the cheating and the fraudulent nature of it is worse. So Americans collectively have no confidence in their institutions. They have no confidence in themselves, I think.
So have you got a democracy there then, or have you got corporates running?
What's a democracy? Democracy, what is it? We're a republic. A democracy is a place where you direct vote everything. We have people we elect to represent us in theory.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we now have taxation without representation in all 50 states.
Yep.
That's the big joke. Nobody represents us in Washington. The place is donor occupied. Donor occupied. Billionaire oligarchs, along with all the big corporate structures, they own Washington. And you can't even get in to see a senator unless you're willing, as an average citizen.
Yep.
You can have 5 minutes with a senator if you pay $10,000 into this PAC for his reelection.
Yep. But why do they want to keep it as it is? I think you said a few minutes
because
back.
Everyone in Washington has grown very rich. The 7 wealthiest counties in the United States surround Washington, D.C.
Okay.
I used to live in Loudoun County, which it surpassed Beverly Hills and all these other places. It used to be excessively wealthy, and the home that I owned was so ridiculously inflated, I sold it. Okay. And I moved 65 miles west of Washington. Well, guess who moved in? Largely foreigners.
Okay.
It's really quite striking. You have these classes of IT millionaires that come in, and they have people behind them that are wannabe millionaires, and they buy up all this real estate. So the Americans are leaving. So you just move out and you leave, and it becomes an extension of India, Bangladesh, whatever.
Is diversity then, with the diversity play working in America?
Diversity is a catastrophe. It always has been. Homogeneity is what makes you powerful. I mean, I give these presentations, and sometimes I show a picture of the Normandy beachhead on a map, and show all the British and Canadian and American forces that came ashore. I said, this is kind of interesting. What's interesting about it? And people say, well, we could bring everybody so far. I said, okay, fine. What else? Eventually it gets down to it's 95% European and they all speak English. Wake up. That's what made us powerful. That's what gave us strength. And this country for the last 50 years has been working tirelessly without understanding it to destroy that.
Yep. Okay.
Well, they've almost succeeded.
Europe is the same. It's a powder keg in Europe at the moment.
Europe is the same. I think it's a little different. I think, and of course, now I have not been, my last trip over there was in 2015.
Okay.
And when I was in Germany, I got off the railroad station I was waiting at the railroad station, and off the train came hundreds of Muslims from North Africa and the Middle East. These were these unwanted migrants. And they saw me standing there, and they came up, and one of them asked me in English where this and this was, and I directed them. And I got out to this town that I had lived in Bavaria. I lived there for a total of 6 years on 2 3-year tours.
Yes.
And it was a beautiful little town, and suddenly it's become 20 to 30% Turkish. And you can imagine the Bavarians are not very happy. When I lived there was no crime. When I lived there, nobody really had to lock their doors. You could walk anywhere you wanted at any time of night. Children, grown-ups, anything. Well, that's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. And I think that's the problem. It's not that you have an overwhelming majority. See, in this country, when you go into the cities, you're looking at a demographic change that is flood. Dimensionally, it's like a flood. There's almost nobody there anymore who was there. Now, my mother's family had been in Philadelphia since 1681.
Yes.
I will never go back to Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a war zone. Once you get past downtown and the historical monuments, it's a catastrophe. Well, what's the demographic change? Well, it's no longer a white city. These things have changed. Now, we can all sit around and say, well, that's very racist. I think that's unkind. Well, my own view is you haven't had to live in it as I have. You haven't had to live through it as many of us have. So you can stuff this where the sun doesn't shine. You get my meaning.
I get it.
The truth is, this is a disaster. It's not working. And, when I was a cadet at West Point, it was a block of instruction that they gave us that I'll never forget. And it was a discussion of the campaign in 1866 between Prussia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. And one of the things that was pointed out is that the Austro-Hungarian army, which was not a bad army, it was reasonably well armed and they had some good officers. But the Austro-Hungarian army was an army where only about 30 to 40% of the soldiers could speak German. And most of them were officers. And that meant that the rest of the army was international.
Yep.
And the joke in Austria always was that by the end of the day, other than the Austrians that were still fighting, the only people that were with them were the Croats. Everybody else left. Well, if you go to the German side, the German army was 95% German. Did that make a difference? Hell yes, it made a difference. They were infinitely more effective than their Austrian counterparts. There were no communications problems. We had a cultural homogeneity. People understood what was expected. And that was presented to me as a cadet at West Point. And of course, then they went on to what I just said to you about Normandy. In other words, we understood that military power rests on a foundation of this human homogeneity, where there's a cultural understanding and a capability to cooperate and work together. As you diminish what I would call the majority until it becomes a minority, that's lost. And of course, that's what happened in Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary no longer exists.
How do you see the role of the US now going forward in the world, depending on which leader wins? Now,
when you say what sort of role, I think it's going to be defined by our actual financial condition.
Well, also military influence as well.
Yeah, but everything depends on the economy.
Yep.
A lot of Americans don't get it. When I go and I talk about military power, I said, you want to pour and pour and pour more and more money into something thinking you're going to get something out of it. The real foundation for military power is our scientific industrial power. What has happened to that? What sort of manufacturing sector do we have, and what does it build? If you don't have assembly lines,
yep,
and we don't have very many anymore, you don't have the innovation that you used to have in industry. Innovation occurs on the shop floor. Anybody who's been in business knows that. It also applies in mining. It applies in so many professions. That's where things really change. And then if you've got a good CEO, he exploits it and takes advantage of it. If he's a bad one, he's one of these insecure narcissists, and it fails, he destroys the business. Well, we learned those lessons. We understood that. And the country was built on that proposition, that it was economic power. Washington said, after he left the presidency, he told everybody, he said, give us 20 years of peace, and no power in the world will challenge us, because we will be the most economically powerful force in the world. Well, he was right. And we had almost no army. He was the man that had led the Continental Army all the way through the Revolutionary War. And we disbanded everything. And we only built back in very small pieces the Navy and the Army as we needed, because we understood that was not a productive sector. In other words, you should maintain only as much military power as you deem necessary for self-defense. If you go beyond that, you're sinking cash into something that has no salvage value. There's no real return on that investment. And today, a lot of technological innovation occurs in the private sector. During World War II and early on, it was in the military sector for obvious reasons.
Yep.
That's less and less the case. So when you say, what's the role going to be? My first point is, what's our financial state?
Yep.
And I think we're going to go broke. I think we're going to default in a big way. And by the way, we defaulted twice.
Yep.
People don't know that in 34 and 36. Only we didn't call it that. We called it restructuring the debt.
Well, what's your debt now? Greater than your GDP, isn't it?
Well, it's I think somebody said it's 140% and rising.
Yeah.
And what we adding another $1 trillion every 100 days? It's just insane. Somebody said it's now, thus far this year, it's consumed 25 to 30% of all tax revenues. I mean, it can't go on. But in those days, we could renegotiate the debt because the people that lent us the money understood that we could pay it back. If you look at the last Treasury auction, just happened a week ago, we could not sell any treasuries that were longer than 2 years. In other words, people would not buy 10 and 30-year treasuries, which is really where, people used to buy those because they wanted long-term investment in the United States, which they saw as a great bet. That's no longer the case. And once you get China and Saudi Arabia and these other places to dump our debt, our treasuries, which is what they're doing, it's only a matter of time until this house of cards that we built financially collapses. So our role in the world is going to be constrained by what we can actually afford. There's a difference between what you want to do and what you have to do. We can get by with half of what we spend on defense, but we want to intervene in other people's countries. We want to meddle in other people's affairs. We want to be able to threaten and bully. So therefore, we spend more money.
And do we trust you anymore?
I don't think so. I mean, that's the other thing, particularly in the Middle East. I think the Middle East is a catastrophe for us. Saudi Arabia is gone. Forget it. They have no confidence or faith in us. I think you're going to see the whole region, most of Africa, much of Asia.
So the Abraham Accord won't come back into life at all?
No.
No way in the world?
Yeah.
So how would you sum up the Middle East then?
I would sum up the thing is, I think somebody said recently that the Israelis, or actually Mr. Netanyahu, has achieved something that has not been the case for over 1,000 years, and that he has unified Persians, Turks, and Arabs, Sunni and Shia, all at once, who can agree on one thing: Israel is trouble. It's been a menace for years. Now it's an existential threat. It needs to go away. And that is the view across the Muslim world. And of course, we fall in behind Israel. In other words, we don't want America around because America is responsible for this.
Do both sides fall in behind Israel? Both the Democrats and the Republicans?
Yes, right now, yeah. Well, listen, you can't, I don't think you can oppose Israel in any real sense on the Hill and really survive. So if you hold a seat in Congress, whether it's the House of Representatives or the Senate, you're not somebody, unless you're wildly independently wealthy and you have a voter base that is impregnable. In other words, you have the staunch support of people in your district or state. You have to bend the knee to Israel, or the Israel lobby will spend money to get rid of you. They'll push you out of office because they'll go and support your alternative because they're a single issue lobby. They don't care what else you do. They just want to be sure that when it's time to give Israel money, when it's time to support Israel, when it's time to back Israel, you will do that. Thomas Massey, he's a Republican from Kentucky.
Yep.
And Thomas Massey gave an interesting interview. If you haven't seen it, I would go look for it, to Tucker Carlson. And it was interesting because he told something that most people didn't understand in the United States. He said every Republican congressman and senator has an Israeli minder. I said, what do you mean? He has a minder. In other words, there's a representative in his office for AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee. And he's there to advise you what you should or should not vote for.
Interesting.
And if you vote for something that the Israel lobby deems as antithetical to their interests, you have a choice. You can change your vote or they'll turn against you. On the Democrat side, it varies because, first of all, large numbers of Democrats don't have to be persuaded, but you also have a new crop of Democrats that have come in, and this is where race seems to figure rather prominently, that are very, very, very anti-Jewish. So right now, I don't think that's a major problem or threat for the Israel lobby. Now, maybe as this war breaks out and people start taking losses and this thing drags on and harms everybody economically, that may change.
So how do you see it playing out? You got Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas. You got the Suez Canal being blocked. You got the Red Sea. You got new tactics happening. You got Iran ready to support. What's
Well,
you're a military person. What's the strategy?
I think you'll probably see an initial firing of weapons from Hezbollah, and then Iran will probably join in. What I don't know is, what does that mean? In other words,
and the response,
how much are they going to employ against Israel? And I'm sure that there are debates even now. I'm sure they have various plans. And I'm quite certain that some people are saying, look, if we're going to do this, let's not hold back. Because we know that when the Israelis counterstrike, they will not hold back. So why should we exercise restraint? And see, to this point in time, whatever you think about the Iranians, they've exercised considerable restraint because they very honestly don't want a war. So, we'll have to see how this turns out. But I think...
Well, what do they want then?
I think they want to be left alone by the Israelis. And I think they want the Israelis to leave Muslims alone in the region. That means stop killing and expelling people from Gaza. That means cut a deal with Hezbollah, recognize the legitimacy of their position on the other side of the border. That means recognizing that they're going to be a normal state in the region. Hezbollah exists today because of the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. Yeah, there was no Hezbollah when the Israelis went in there. So I had Israelis sit me down and tell me that when I've been over there several times since 1999. They said, yeah, we're pretty stupid. We created Hezbollah. Then, of course, you realize that Hamas was also a creature of the Israeli government and the Mossad because they thought it could be developed as a useful counter to other groups, particularly the Palestinian Authority. They wanted to divide the Palestinians.
Yep.
Mr. Netanyahu, to some extent, that was his brainchild. All of these things have backfired on them rather badly. So if the answer is we just have to kill more Muslims, which appears to be the solution at this stage, I don't think that's going to work.
But didn't they return Gaza back to Hamas?
So, yes, they returned it nominally to Arabs, but you remember that Gaza was originally under Egyptian administration.
Yes.
Until after the 1973 war.
Yep.
And when it came to discussing who would take it back and who would run it and so forth, Anwar Sadat told Begin, forget it. We don't want anything to do with it. But there was a tacit agreement that the Egyptians and the Israelis would cooperate to contain the problem. Mm. And indeed, that's what they've done. Mm. The Egyptians and the Israelis have worked very carefully together to deal with various forms of Islamic jihadists that emerged inside Gaza and cooperated with other people in the Sinai. In fact, that's one of the casualties, I think, of this particular conflict right now, which is so tragic, that Egypt and Israel had a good modus vivendi. I think that's dead now, and I don't see it being restored. In fact, I'll be very surprised if General Sisi survives in Egypt and we do not have a coup and see a much more radical anti-Israeli, anti-Western government come to power there. I think the same threat is very real in Jordan. King Abdullah is another one that now is regarded widely as an Israeli puppet. I don't think that's fair. I think he and his father both tried to maintain stability and commerce and so forth. But that's the view, and I think he will be gone. I think that Mohammed bin Salman has figured out that he's got to get on the right side of this issue, or he too might be out of a job. I think this is a wave that has sort of washed over the Islamic world. They're taking a position that Israel does. The Israelis take the position you're either with us or against us. I think all of the Islamic states have taken a similar position. Either you're with us or against us.
And if the Israelis in the America, I don't know if the Americans will, but if the Israelis hit Iran, if they decide to do so, do you see potentially a destabilization of the Iranian government, totalitarian and strong, a potential rise by the people?
Do any of the people in Iran have a weapon?
No, but there was an Arab Spring. There was an Arab Spring some time ago. It was supported.
Yeah, but they have no weapons. That's why we have the Second Amendment to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the United States.
To bear arms. Yep.
They have no way of rebelling against anybody. They'll be shot to pieces. It's right. It's that simple. I mean, look at the people in England that are rebelling effectively. They're very unhappy, but what can they do about it? They don't have any weapons. And this is true all over Europe. This is the problem that we have with this desire to turn everyone into a sedated consumer who will mindlessly behave the government, take all their weapons away, and they have no choice.
Okay.
That's why we Americans will never do that.
Okay. What's your thoughts on, at the moment, the state of play in Ukraine and Russia and the push by the Ukrainians of late into Russia? And I've listened to a lot of your commentary.
This is not much of a push. There's a few thousand, and it looks like this was planned in Great Britain. And we have evidence that there are a number of American, British advisors involved in this. And I think they simply looked at the border with Russia. And remember, the entire border of Russia is not fortified and defended. The war is actually contained. And this is a very large area in Ukraine. Americans have no idea what they're dealing with. I mean, you've got something the size of Texas you're fighting over. We haven't done anything like that for a long time. Even in the European campaigns, we never conducted war on the scale that the Germans and the Soviets did, or the Germans and the Austrians and Russians did during World War I.
And as NATO and the Americans let down,
there's an understanding of the dimensions.
Yep.
So what we did is we ran the satellites on passes across the territory, and we saw the areas that were lightly defended. I think in this particular area where they penetrated, there were only 50 policemen initially. And so they said, this is great. We can make a splash. Then somebody decided, well, let's go for the nuclear power plant in Kursk. Because if we can damage the plant and cause an emergency, that will harm Russia. And maybe that'll give us a chance and convince people in the West to continue to support us. It was part PR and part strategic, as it was aimed at the Kursk nuclear power plant. They did damage the cooling system at the power plant, but that's being repaired. And they are being systematically annihilated as you and I are sitting here.
Yeah.
And I'll be interested to see the bodies, which I'm sure will include some Americans and Brits, because we've already lost people there that we never admit to. And I'm sure the Russians will be happy to put them on television. The bad news here for the future is that Putin has now announced, and I can't blame him for it, there will be no negotiations. This is over. And to me, that means that he's going to finish off this regime in Kiev. Now, how he does it and when and where, I don't know, but there's not much to stop him from moving forward. But the issue for him, the dilemma for him and for the Russians has always been, they don't want to rule Ukrainians. The areas that he's currently controlling are full of Russians.
But it's still sovereign land. They're still there. It was still Ukraine before he went in there. It was given back, remember?
Well, let's put it this way.
I know it's been under Russian control many years ago and everything else by history, but it was sovereign to that point, correct?
It was Russian from 1776.
Yeah, but it was given back by the USSR.
No, the USSR, you had Khrushchev in a drunken bout at his dacha, who decided to reward his communist buddies, who incidentally, the communist buddies that ran Ukraine, they were Russians.
Yeah.
They weren't Ukrainians. No Ukrainian nationalist will tell you, oh, we got it back. Bull. That's just nonsense. In fact, we had many Ukrainians in the United States. Jack Palance, a very famous movie star, was Ukrainian, came from Pennsylvania, where I'm from. And he was awarded some medal from the Ukrainian USSR for his brilliant performances. And he basically spat in their faces and said, you are not Ukrainians. I don't know anything about what you are, but you're not Ukrainian. So at that point, I mean, that's sort of like shuffling a town or two on the border with Pennsylvania back and forth to New York when nobody's paying attention. It's irrelevant. What you've got now, and this is an old part of the world where borders have changed repeatedly over many years. Populations have changed. Putin understands that. The populations in eastern Ukraine were Russian. The majority of the population on Crimea was not Ukrainian. And the non-Ukrainians were being treated as second and third class citizens. They were being punished in courts of law. They were at a tremendous disadvantage because they were being subject to Ukrainianization. And the Russians didn't like it. And that was the purpose of the Minsk Accords. Those were drafted with the object of holding Ukraine intact, but addressing these critical issues to satisfy Russian sensibilities. Well, we now know that the Minsk Accords were a fraud because Chancellor Merkel made that very clear. Macron has admitted it was just to buy time to build up a bigger Ukrainian army whose goal was to attack Russia. Hello, I would have done exactly what Putin did. And I would not give up an inch of territory right now that has a Russian living on it to the Ukrainians again. So he doesn't want to go further west if he can avoid it. He really doesn't, because he doesn't want to manage and govern Ukrainians. He wants them to do that for themselves. The problem is, how does he get that done as long as the Zelensky regime is in Kiev? And that's a whole nother question.
So from that perspective, we started on Eisenhower and we talked about NATO. So is this been an absolute complete failure by NATO and the Americans? And why are the Americans still supporting something which is costing lives and an enormous amount of money and capital? If you think at the end of the day, we're wasting our time and Putin's outsmarted all of us.
Oh, absolutely. We're wasting our time. And we have no historic or current or past strategic interest in Eastern Ukraine. Who controls Eastern Ukraine is of no consequence to us whatsoever on a purely strategic level. I think this is an entirely fraudulent war perpetrated by people in Washington, London, and Kiev. And that's a puppet government that we set up. There are lots of people that are behind this, but I think as far as NATO goes, I think NATO is pretty much dead man walking. I think it'll go out of existence. In January, before the invasion commenced, I was interviewed, and you can look it up, by Dmitry Symes, as a Russian who ran the Center for National Interest. And he asked me the same question. I said, if we embark on this, it will be the end of NATO.
Yeah, okay.
But NATO won't end until you see the current governments go away. And you're going to see that happen. I think you're going to see Scholz gone. I think you're going to see Macron go. And I think you're going to see changes in Scandinavia. The real question is what happens in Britain. I don't know that. I can't predict that one. I just don't know. But I know the Germans and the German population is definitively turned against this Ukrainian war thing. I don't think they know the whole story because the press has studiously avoided telling the truth. But enough is coming through now. They have enough Ukrainians on the ground in Germany that they do understand what's happening. So I think Scholz will go away, and the Christian Social Union in Bavaria, which is the sort of Bavarian wing of the Christian Democratic Union, has said, either you get on board and we end this war, or we're leaving the union with you. So I think things are really going to change. France has always been a bellwether for change. You know what Metternich used to say, if they sneeze in Paris, Europe catches a cold. Well, I think Europe's caught the cold.
Do you think Trump will do the deal if he gets in charge?
First of all, I don't know. He's got people around him who don't want to do the deal. He's appointing people who are warmongers, people who are neocons. This was his problem during his first term. He didn't pay attention to who they were. If you go back and look, and he was asked about so-and-so and so-and-so, what about this man as your national security advisor? He's a well-known neocon warmonger. He said, he doesn't matter. He said, why not? Because I make all the decisions. Well, Donald Trump should have learned by now that he was dead wrong. It matters very much who becomes a cabinet officer. We have 5,000 appointed positions in Washington.
Yeah.
You got to fill them all. And you got to fill them with the right people. If you're filling them with people that don't agree with you, that don't support you, that are told to ignore you, which is what happened, then how much can you reasonably accomplish? So I don't know what President Trump has learned about this.
All right. Now, we started on the conversation talking about where the power lies with the US regards to the economy. Now, if we talk about the economy, the global economy, that's world trade. And now we've got the likes of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran creating, in many regards, a very strong relationship. And you've got the US trading with Europe, which is sort of floundering in certain areas. What's your take on the shift and how we've allowed that to happen? Is it good, bad? And China has flexed its muscle, and they played a smart, very tight game.
Well, North Korea has been circling the drain for years economically. It's a basket case. The Russians sort of continued to try and help sustain it as much as they could, but within limitations. And you'll recall that in 2019, that President Trump and I was in touch then with his offices, understood that this was a time to make some hard decisions. And you had a government in South Korea that very much wanted us to leave. By the way, I think most Koreans would still like us to leave, and I think we will. But at the time, there was an opportunity to do it under very favorable circumstances and to get something for it. And behind the scenes, it was very clear that we could get a deal for denuclearization in North Korea if we tied it over a period of, say, 5 years to U.S. withdrawals from North Korea. Now, why is that, or from South Korea? Now, why is that important? Well, if you withdraw from the peninsula of South Korea, there's no requirement for us to be in Japan.
Yeah.
We have ground troops in Japan who are there to reinforce the defense of South Korea. In other words, this leads to the demilitarization of our relationship with Asia, which is desirable. We don't want to go to war with anybody in Asia. Anybody who says that we should be prepared to is insane. It's just abundantly stupid. So no, we don't want to go to war with anybody. There are people in Washington who want to go to war with everybody in sight every other damn day, and they have no idea what the hell war is. They've never seen it, never will. Or they might, but if they do, it's their own fault. But the point is that North Korea is on the whole really a Russian satellite. And given what's happened now, I think the Russians have decided that North Korea is extraordinarily useful. Because one of the first things that a lot of us warned the administration was, you're focused on what's happening in Ukraine, but the Russians can escalate horizontally. Where do the Russians have good relations? They have good relations in Cuba, good relations in Venezuela, good relations in Mexico. So do the Chinese. Mexico has always been hostile to us. They hosted the Germans, then they hosted the Soviets. The largest KGB operation outside of Russia was in Mexico. We have never had good relations with Mexico, which is why we had the army on the border there from 1846 to 1948. So none of this is new. We've just been negligent and complacent and let this metastasize. We don't want to go to war with Mexico. We don't need to go to war with Mexico. We need to close the border. We need to secure the border. We need to establish the rule of law. We need to militarize that border to make sure that no one can penetrate it anymore. That's different. You don't go to war. I hear idiots all the time. Well, Mexico, we need to go to war with the cartels. We're going to have a war with the cartels. As soon as we close that border, the war is going to be inside our country.
Right.
That's what people don't understand. That's how serious the situation is here at home, which is why we're going to leave. We're going to leave Europe. We're going to leave Asia. We're going to back out of everything because, first of all, we can't afford it. And secondly, it's not vital to us anymore. What's the most vital thing? Our own country.
So it's going to become very
national security.
So very inward then.
What?
Very inward then on the world stage.
Yes.
Okay.
It has to be that way.
So no longer the policeman of the world?
No, hell no. We never wanted to be either. That was Eisenhower's point. We didn't want to be the policeman all over the world.
You've been doing a lot of interference.
JFK, don't go into Vietnam.
There's been a lot of interference for a long time then.
What do you mean?
Yeah, well, the Americans.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's because Americans paid no attention to what was happening in Washington until it became so offensive and so disgusting that they had to, and that was Vietnam. Okay. It took us 10 years to finally disengage from Vietnam.
Yep.
Americans only started paying attention to it about 1969, 1970.
Yep. And
when I went for my physical exam in 1970, I went to an Army hospital not far from where I lived in Philadelphia. And I was there with dozens of other young men. We were all going through these physicals to see whether or not we could qualify to go to the military academy. And we walked through these wards, and the wards were filled with young men our age, 19, 20, 21, 18, amputees, shot to pieces, lives ruined.
Yes.
So I went through that. The other people didn't pay much attention. They went on to do whatever they did. I came out. I was very shocked by the whole thing. My mother made me go back in and look at it. She was a Quaker. She said, go back, look at it, and then come out after you've been through those wars and you're going to answer a question. I said, I did what my mother said. She raised me. I came back out and I said, yes, Mom, I saw it. She said, do you still want to be a professional soldier? Do you still want to go to West Point? I said, yes, Mom. And she said, you're a hard case.
The withdrawal out of Afghanistan.
Well, the withdrawal out of Afghanistan.
Did it trigger the events that the Americans just couldn't work out?
Well, I think Americans got a taste of the widespread incompetence and low level of professionalism that characterized the senior ranks of our armed forces. And I remember I spoke on television and I was castigated the hell out of it. And President Trump called me and he said, that's great. You're right. We would never have done that, blah, blah, blah. But the truth is all those generals were there under him.
That's right.
He should have gotten rid of them, but he wouldn't act. And I wasn't the only person that said, look, we've got a clean house. We've got real problems. We've had decades of no real action against anybody that can fight back. Now, the British went through that, and they suffered through that in World War I. And frankly, I would argue, with the exception of Montgomery and a few others, things weren't so hot during the Second World War either with them because of this imperial policing nonsense. Same thing with the French. And if you go back before all those wars, those various armies and their leaders all said, well, the Germans have no experience. What have they done? Well, the Germans studied war, the real damn thing. So did the Soviets. We didn't. We haven't. People are watching what's happening over in Ukraine. And the second book I wrote, which is Transformation Under Fire, I talked about the ISR strike maneuver complex, where you integrate space-based and terrestrial intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance with strike. The Russians have done it.
Yeah. You
can't stick your head outside of a foxhole in Ukraine without having something try to kill you. They paralyzed the enemy. And that's what you want. That was something we needed to work on. We should have learned that much earlier. Well, now we're looking at it, but I don't see a big rush to do anything because, again, we live within this anachronistic World War II construct.
So, but the intelligence that you get and the resources and investment that you spend on intelligence, the Russians have come back emboldened, stronger. And you just talked about their advance in technology. All the trade tariffs on oil has completely and utterly failed. The economy seems to be coming back up, one of the strongest in the world now. So where's your intelligence in the US?
Well, the intelligence, there's two problems with intelligence, okay? Number one, most of the people that look at these things are not familiar with the population, with the country, with the culture, the language on the ground.
So looking through certain other eyes. Okay.
So that's a problem. Now, you will have some exceptions, but not many. And so there was no understanding that Russia has this tremendous backstop of resources. How are you going to isolate a country which can frankly live without you? It can grow its own food, produce its own minerals, produce its own metals, develop all the technology that it needs. It doesn't need you. We didn't think in those terms. We tended to go back to Iraq. We thought we were so brilliant that we successfully isolated Iraq. That wasn't very hard. And then we defeated them. That wasn't very hard. This was not a major scientific industrial power, an advanced country. We lost sight of this. We have this view of the Russians as knuckle-dragging Neanderthals. They are not. Anyone who thinks so is making a very serious mistake. So that's number one. The second the proper study of what counts was not done. And the second problem is that when the Intelligence Committee produces a recommendation that doesn't sit well with the political masters, they have a tendency to say, no, I don't think so. Go back and do that again. And then you get somebody like Bob Gates, who became Secretary of Defense, who was in the CIA. He learned that very quickly. And he began to feed the boss what he wanted to hear and see. That's how you get ahead in Washington. Everybody does whatever the boss wants. And that I remember being told that when I was in the Army. Your job is to give the boss what the boss wants. And I always sat there and said, what if the boss is an idiot and he's dead wrong and he's going to get everybody killed?
Yep.
Nobody wanted to hear that. No, you do what the boss says. So, I mean, one quick little anecdote that maybe of use to you. I was in the War Plans Division of the Army Staff in 1995. This was 94, just as I was starting out. I'd been there 2 months, 3 months. By the colonel came to me in the strategic plans, and I had responsibility for all the what we call the white war plans, not the black ones, the spec ops and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, here, write a paper on the Balkans. What do you think we should do? Do we fit in there? Do we not fit in there? Should we involve ourselves? Whatever. Pros and cons, give us a recommendation. So I did. I sat down, put it in 2 pages, gave it back to him. He said, oh, this is good. I like this. Went to the Major General. The Major General took it. Went to the 3-star. He took it. Was passed up to the 4-star Chief of Staff. And basic recommendation was, this is not an area of long-term strategic interest to the United States. But historically, the Balkans is an area of strategic interest to Russia.
Yep.
And for all intents and purposes, everybody there is a Russian tenant. In other words, the Russians manage the land there.
Yep.
And we really want to get along with the Russians, and we're doing very well right now. So we want to avoid friction. And I went through this basically, and the Russians liberated the whole area from the Muslim Turks. And, even the people that don't like the Russians that live there recognize that. Okay, so I said, we should not directly involve ourselves. No permanent U.S. military presence. Avoid involvement, right? Chief of Staff of the Army said, I agree. He took it over to the White House. How do you think that went down? The White House said, wrong.
Yeah, right.
We're intervening.
Interesting.
We intervened. And then I was at the Dayton peace talks. I was working for General Clark then when he was a 3-star, and I was a full colonel. And, I did some map work and drawing boundaries for the various groups, the Croats, the Serbs, and the Bosniaks. And he got some instructions from then Secretary of Defense Perry, and I thought they were very good instructions. And Secretary Perry said, General Clark, first of all, we don't want any Danzig corridors. No hanging pieces of real estate with nothing between them and the parent state. In other words, don't do that. Make sure borders are contiguous. We don't want any future catalyst for conflict. He said, the next thing is no permanent U.S. military presence. We don't want 50, 100,000 U.S. troops stuck in the Balkans.
Yeah, right.
We need to have them on hand for deployment against a real enemy somewhere else if we need to do it. And then finally, he said something that was very good. He said, no agreement is better than a bad agreement. Brilliant guidance. It all went down the toilet because the Clinton administration wanted what it wanted, and it got it. So my point to you is that you do have competent people in the intelligence arena, and many times they come forward with the right answers.
Yep.
But it doesn't matter.
Doesn't get the light of day. Like coming to the end, we're having this conversation, and I'm coming out of Australia. And day in, day out, we look up above us and we've got China. We've got South China Sea. We've got the whole Pacific changing. We've got a lot of money being spent and invested in islands for ports, for control, etc. How do you see the South Pacific, and how do you see would America come to our aid, and what's Australia's role in the American defense strategy?
Are you expecting a Chinese invasion?
I'm not, but
okay.
But you read things every day of the week, and you talk it up as that's part of the political narrative.
What is of critical interest to us? I mean, let's look at that from a purely military standpoint. Number one, the Chinese have never stopped a commercial vessel. In other words, commerce moves in and out of China through the South China Sea, through the Malacca Straits, into the Indian Ocean and back. And between the Sea of Japan and the United States, no one interferes with that. Chinese don't interfere with it. So that's number one. That's important. We would like that to stay. And I don't see any evidence that the Chinese want to change that because they're very dependent on that. As we discussed earlier, what happens if the Straits of Hormuz are closed? They're in a lot of trouble.
Absolutely.
Because Russians will give them all the natural gas and oil they can, but it's not enough to sustain that country. So that's the first thing. Second thing is these little islets North Vietnam actually has militarized, fortified, and controls more little islets than China does. We never hear about that. Of the countries in the region, I would say the most oppressive, other than North Korea, is Vietnam, infinitely more oppressive. You know, the big joke in that part of the world where there's Confucian culture, and I'm sure you understand what that means.
Yep.
If you look at in their court system, if you are accused of a crime and you go to court, the probability of being found guilty in China is 99%. In Japan, it's 98%. In South Korea, it's 98%. In Taiwan, 98%. In North Korea, of course, 100%. And in Vietnam, 99%.
Okay.
So, gee, just tell me what you want to change, okay? You're out of your mind. You're not going to change anything in that part of the world. So give up on all this nonsense of democratizing anybody. And most of the people in the world are looking at us and say, well, if this is evidence for liberal democracy, what we see in America and Europe, we don't want it. And if you're looking for what they do want, and I've spent time in Asia with the Chinese on Taiwan and the Chinese in China want, they all want to live in Singapore. And Singapore is a very successful fascist state. That's what they want. They're interested in making money, living well.
Yep.
And if somebody gets out of line in their culture, that person needs to be punished and dealt with. So let's understand the cultural preferences. When you look at the South China Sea and the claims that are made there, Taiwan shares in all of those claims. Both Taiwan and the mainland Chinese all make the same claims. There's no difference at all. No one ever talks about the Taiwanese.
Mm.
No one ever talks about the islands that the Vietnamese control. Now, here's another very important point. How long do you last on any of those islets if you put any military power on them? Most admirals in the U.S. Navy would say 10 to 15 minutes because there's no way to protect yourself.
Yep.
It's impossible. So do they really threaten anybody? Well, if they do, they won't threaten very long. So the key thing is we should be interested as Americans in what we've always been interested in, which is business and trade.
Yep.
If that flows freely and unencumbered, then we shouldn't be a part of what goes on there. And if you leave the people in the region alone long enough, they'll sort it out. The Vietnamese and the Chinese, who hate each other and would go to war tomorrow if they thought it was necessary without hesitation, have established a hotline between Beijing and Hanoi City, or Ho Chi Minh City, right?
Yep.
So they don't want to go to war. They're not stupid. The Filipinos, the president of the Philippines is saying, we probably don't need these Americans. They're a catalyst for trouble because he's picked up the phone and called Xi, and things have sorted out in the Philippine Sea. Are these things going to happen again? Well, Vietnamese and Chinese fishermen routinely pull up next to each other, and it looks like the Battle of Trafalgar.
Correct.
Well, that's their problem, not ours. So I think you understand that. Now, finally, China is headed into a very deep recession right now. Their banking system is a catastrophe.
Mm.
And every morning, President Xi wakes up and he says the same thing. Probably. I don't know for certain. He hasn't confided me, but he doesn't say, how can I attack America? That's crap. He says, how do I hold 1.4 billion Chinese together? So I am not worried about the Chinese. And I don't think we need to be in the condition we are, in the posture we are in Asia. Because I also know something else. I've seen the Japanese Navy. I've seen the Japanese Armed Forces. And if they had to fight the Chinese at sea, the Chinese are finished.
Right, okay.
The Japanese are superb.
They're investing heavily, I know that, that's for sure. Where's the American fleet now compared to the Chinese?
In trouble. We have had to strip out other crews in order to bring the 3 carrier battle groups that we want for this current conflict in the Middle East up to strength. Our maintenance is in a shambles because we have effectively overused everything.
Your Air Force is still good.
We did some work, overused everything. In other words, we've just overused the fleet. We've overused everything on repeated deployments to places that were not necessary. We never needed them to begin with in these places. My son graduated from the Naval Academy, and he left as soon as he could get out of the Navy. Like the Navy, but he couldn't figure out what the hell we were doing, cutting squares in the Indian Ocean. He was over there when the Somali pirates were running out of control, and all the officers on board ship said, "Let's take care of the Somali pirates. We'd love to do that. We're well armed. We can do that." The captain said, "No, our mission is to deter the Iranians from attacking the Emirates." And everybody knew that wasn't going to happen.
Does Australia have
It's a waste of time. One of the things to keep in mind about the Navy, too, they're having problems recruiting because people don't want to live at sea for years at a time. It's insane. And the other thing is that these carriers are not the great weapons they once were. I mean, you have an opportunity to lose a carrier in a war or have it severely damaged. That's a strategic game changer. Carriers are now, and in fact, I would argue much of the surface fleet is only for use in what I would call permissive environments. If they have to fight an enemy that has effective ISR strike that can reach out 150 nautical miles, then you have to move the surface fleet out there to avoid being hit by them. If they have deep sea capable submarines, you're still at risk. Right now, fortunately, that's less of an issue, but that'll become an issue in the future. I've watched carrier battle groups race 150 miles away from the coastline of Yugoslavia because they thought diesel subs were there and would threaten them. These are instrumentalities of the Second World War. And you don't have to sink a carrier. All you have to do is put a couple of holes in the flight deck. The thing doesn't work worth a damn. And we also don't have enough surface ships as we once did around the carriers because we haven't seen the need for it. One of the admirals pointed out yesterday, we used to have 7 or 8 surface ships protecting the carrier. They were there for air defense, but they were also there to stop the torpedoes. In other words, they were supposed to take the damage, not the carrier. Well, we don't have 7 or 8 ships to do that anymore. We have 3 or 4. So everything has changed, but we have not. We're living in the past. That's a very comfortable place to live, by the way, if you're in the military, because that way nothing changes. And that's what most generals and admirals want. No change.
Do we have a role to play down here in Australia?
You have a role to play. I think your role is one aimed at survival. You're a colony living in Asia. I don't know what that future means for you, but I know you have your problems with immigration. People matter. Human capital is everything. Homogeneity holds things together. You can always have minorities. In other words, some numbers of people on the margin that are different. That's fine. But when they threaten the majority culture, the majority mentality, the majority way of life, you've got a problem. And I still think your best bet in the region right now is Japan. Cooperation with them. Had I been in your position, I would absolutely not have invested in a French or piece of equipment. I would not have invested in our stuff. I would have invested in Japanese material. I would not imitate us. That's the tendency everywhere. That's gotten the British into trouble.
Yeah, right.
We're the wrong model. You don't want to police the world. We've been building things for years for global dominance. I mean, I've sat in these briefings. If we build these aircraft and we'll have global military dominance. Well, what they mean is global military hegemony. Well, that's an illusion. It's prohibitively expensive, and it gets you into trouble because you're predisposed to stick your nose into places it doesn't belong.
And if we're in trouble, would America come and support us? Where's the bond there? We hear about it, but is there real consideration now? Going back to your point, you're going inwardly as a country as opposed to outwardly.
Yeah, well, I think we are inwardly focused, but we were inwardly focused before World War II.
Yep.
And we still came to your aid and assistance.
Yes.
The problem is, what can we reasonably do for you? This is not the Second World War anymore. In other words, are we going to have 1,000 ships in the Pacific Ocean? I don't think so, because they're just targets bobbing up and down in the ocean. Those days are over. So I think in terms of when you say cooperation, what can we do to cooperate? Well, we can share technology. We share intelligence. I don't see much evidence that will change in the near term.
Okay.
But, it's the same thing I've had to tell Europeans. If you're waiting for 1,000 transports to show up in your harbors and thousands of airplanes to deliver 1 million soldiers, days are over. We couldn't get there anyway. And that's the problem. Crossing the Pacific is not an easy task. Everybody underestimates the impact of persistent surveillance.
What do you mean by that?
The space-based surveillance can see everything everywhere all the time. We have thousands of satellites up there. Now, not all of them have military utility, but we have enough satellites up there that we can cover the areas that we think are of strategic importance to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so do the Russians, and so do the Chinese. Increasingly, so do the Japanese. Even the Israelis have a satellite. The British have some. So under those circumstances, when you have persistent surveillance, you can't have a Pearl Harbor. You're not going to have an Ardennes offensive. The only way you could get those things is if you disrupt the satellites, disrupt them or destroy them. And there are only a few ways to do that, and they usually lead to major war. So under those circumstances, warfare changes.
Yeah. Other ways to break a country is not necessarily by military influence, but by economic influence and devaluations of currency. US currency. Yeah. I think you've got some fairly firm views on that, have you not?
We're headed into tough times.
And we've got new forms of currency as well. You're quite an advocate of Bitcoin?
Yeah, I like Bitcoin. I think the future in some form is digital currency that is not controlled by the banks. It's going to be a real struggle.
Why do you believe that so much?
I just don't think fiat currency is going to have much value anymore unless it's backed directly by either gold or a collection of metals, rare metals. I mean, maybe you toss in platinum. I don't know what else. And that's, I think, what's going to happen with BRICS. And they're going to have a system where their currency or the currencies that are part of BRICS will be backed by gold initially, potentially silver and other things too. When a transaction occurs at the location where these metals are kept, that will be executed, and that backs the fiat currency. I don't think, can do that with our currency. And so I think some form of digital currency will emerge as an alternative. And of course, there's some countries, small admittedly, I think, Nicaragua or El Salvador have adopted digital currency. I think we'll see more of that. It's going to take time. It's not something that happens overnight. I mean, people worry about, the SWIFT system. It takes time to build a system like that.
Yeah.
So it's not going to happen instantaneously. The point is, and this is what Americans don't really get right now, they don't understand it, is the world is moving away from us. They don't want to be dependent on us. They don't want to be dependent on our finances, on our trade or anything else, because we've weaponized those so often.
Yep.
Now, can we get them back? Not right away and not for a while. We've got to change our behavior and the way we do business. We're not willing to do that at the moment. Just look at the Middle East.
Well, what is leadership? If you're going to define that, you've seen plenty of it, and this is a discussion around leadership. If you're going to sum that up, how would you give narrative around leadership?
That's unfair.
It is unfair.
You were going to ask me that question.
It is unfair, but that's part of the show.
Somebody said that leadership is making everybody happy to go to hell and feel good about it. I don't know. I think there's a difference between leadership and command. Command is very different from leadership. There are people who are very good at leading at lower levels, but can't command worth a damn. The Germans understood that. Bonaparte understood it. I don't think we ever completely grasped it. So we always tended to follow the Peter principle, promote them until they reach their level of incompetence, as opposed to having a system that tried to sort talent. By the way, the Israeli Defense Force does a good job of that. And I always urge everybody to look at it. And of course, they borrowed heavily from the Germans.
Yeah.
So leadership, you're talking about leadership and command, because the people that are at the top of national state structures have to do both. And we just haven't had very many people who are exceptionally gifted at it. We were lucky in the United States after World War II that we ended up with Eisenhower, who learned so much during the war. And he had a good head on his shoulders, and he was not interested in aggrandizing himself or expanding American national power. In fact, it was just the opposite. He wanted to build up power at home. But then again, we had a series of presidents that fell into that trap. And I think Kennedy was a good leader, but he didn't understand command very well until it was too late. And command is different. He did not understand the criticality of the man in the White House commanding the armed forces. And they went rogue on him. And he stopped it. We avoided a nuclear exchange, thank goodness. I think if Jack Kennedy had gone into a second term, if he'd have been reelected, he would have been a super president. But he was not very well prepared. And how do you get that kind of preparation? We don't promote that. You just don't step out of Yale or West Point or somewhere and you're instantly qualified for anything. But if you look at other countries, they have systems designed to sort of promote competent people. Mm. And I would tell you that Putin and Xi, whether you like them or not, are both highly intelligent and very effective, much more so than any of us. The other thing is that we Americans have never really had a strategy. People talk about the Cold War, but we were so big, we were left alone for so long, and we're so wealthy, we didn't need a strategy. And the strategy was we control everything between the Atlantic and the Pacific.
You still think you're absent of strategy now?
What?
Are you still absent of strategy now?
Oh, yes. We have no strategy. What we have is a wish list. We want the world to be liberal and democratic. This is just fanciful bullshit. It's nonsense. That's what we have for a strategy. Yeah. And then we create enemies when they don't exist. Why are we saying China is a potential existential threat? Well, they're very wealthy. Okay. China, for most of its 5,000 years, has been the wealthiest country in the world. Didn't threaten much of anybody. And the only time they did threaten somebody was when they were under the Mongolian rule of Mongolian dynasties who naturally wanted to expand. Yeah. Chinese are not in that business. It's not them. It's not the way they think. So they have their strategy is very inwardly focused since they see themselves at the center of the world. Russia's strategy was to control as much terrain far from Moscow as possible to ensure an invader would have a tough time reaching the Russian center. And that was the Tsar's goal.
Yep.
Keep all these people away because if we don't, they'll come here and take us over. We don't have a strategy right now, but we should have a strategy for hemispheric defense. That means we have to look to our own continent and our own borders and our own waters. And we haven't paid much attention to them for too long.
So who's going to seize the leadership, Douglas, in the Middle East then?
Well, I think you have rising powers in the Middle East. I certainly think that Iran, simply by virtue of its size, the Iranian landmass is almost the size of Western Europe and its population. If you go back and look at Samuel Huntington in his book, not Clash of Civilizations as much, although it's in there also, political development in changing societies, he pointed to Iran as by far the most advanced and sophisticated of the Islamic states with the best educated population, and predicted that, if we could avoid going to war with them and killing them, that they could play a very positive role. I happen to agree with Huntington. I think that's true too. I think Turkey, for reasons of its population and culture, is a power.
Yeah.
They have had a series of people since Ataturk who have chosen not to exercise it. They're on the brink of changing in that regard. I think when Erdogan is gone, you're going to see a very different Turkey, much more assertive and aggressive, particularly in its own area. And, we don't pay much attention to Latin America, and I think the Latin American people are lucky. The less we pay attention to them, the better off they'll be. I have a son who lives in Argentina. He's down in Buenos Aires, and he says people down here have no interest at all in what we're doing and think we're crazy. They have a very different culture, a very different way of looking at the world. They're not interested in invading anybody. It's, Latin America, it may not be perfect, but it has certain virtues. And that has made the outbreaks of destructive wars almost impossible. That's a good thing. Mm. So, when you say, what's our role? I think it should be exactly what Washington said. He and Hamilton argued vociferously with Jefferson. Jefferson wanted us to join the French Revolution. Just imagine that. And of course, Washington and Hamilton thought he was certifiable. They liked him, but that was the craziest idea imaginable. And Washington said, well, if we were to do that, we'd have the Austrian, Prussian, Russian, British armies on the North American continent doing everything they can to extinguish us. So he said, our mission in the world is to be the world's engine of prosperity.
Yeah, okay.
And if we are successful, people will want to imitate us because they will see that we are successful and doing well. But we don't want to be involved in other people's wars. That's destructive. We've learned that. That's ultimately why we broke away.
Douglas, I've got to ask you the last question as part of our show. If you were to look back at that young man many years ago, leaving high school in Philadelphia, what advice would you give him now?
Well, anybody who's starting out, I would say the same thing that I told myself at the time. And I guess this is to paraphrase Winston Churchill. He's not one of my favorite people, by the way, but he seems to be someone who's always had something to say about everything and occasionally gets it right. That is when he's sober. And he said, don't like what you do what you like. In other words, try to merge whatever task you undertake, whatever job you have with your passion. And if you do that, you will be happy and you will be very successful. And my passion was always the military, the profession of arms. And I always used to say I'm the most fortunate man in the world because what I'm doing is my hobby. I like it. Other people were never that way. They were always there to do something to get somewhere. I never did that. And I think you're much happier then. So that's the only advice I have.
On that, Douglas, thank you very much for making the time today. It's been a great, great conversation.
Great. Thank you. And God bless everybody down under.
Thanks very much. On that, you've been listening to No Limitations.